This month we've been focusing on the idea of singing, the singing that we do here in our collective worship together. Last week we focused on how singing is there for us to teach and to admonish each other, to instruct each other. It's not just coming together and singing some stuff that sounds good and gives us some kind of an emotional high, but that we are actively engaging and teaching, admonishing each other. We just sang a song together. Why? Why do we do this? It's kind of a pretty time-tested practice. I've never been, I don't think, to a worship service, a full worship service before, where there wasn't a song sung at some point before the sermon or the Lord's Supper or at all. It's a very effective tool to get everybody on the same page together. In fact, the singing as part of a worship goes way back into temple worship, we know in the Old Testament, as well as even being kind of ritually part of pagan worship as far back as we have any kinds of records. Singing has always been associated with worship. What's interesting is that even Jesus engaged in singing. In Matthew 26 and verse 30, it says, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. Jesus singing? What kind of a voice did he have? Did he have a good baritone voice, a tenor voice, maybe a deep bass voice, or maybe a mic voice? I mean, what kind of a voice did Jesus have as he was singing? They were there. They were gathered together. He and his disciples, they sang a hymn. And you ask the question, what is it that they sang? It probably wasn't the old rugged cross, considering Jesus hasn't yet gone to the old rugged cross. But I'm going to suggest that what they sang probably was not very far off. This morning, what I want to do is to look at perhaps what they were singing. In fact, I think we know pretty much exactly what they were singing, and focus a few minutes on the song that Jesus probably sang on the night of his betrayal. Good morning. It's good to be here this morning, isn't it? It's good to engage in the singing together, partaking of the Lord's Supper together, being here together. And I'm going to take just a moment. I made a comment in class, in Dave's class last week from 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 4, says, we ourselves boast about you in the churches of God. Actually, I think that might have been chapter 2. Anyway, there's a phrase where Paul says it was chapter 1. We boast about you in all the churches of God. And I made a comment that said, it's interesting that when Paul found that there was something worthy of commending, he would talk to other people about it. But he doesn't stop there. He comes back and tells Thessalonians, hey, these are the things that I've been telling other people about you. These are the positive things that I'm making sure everyone else knows. These are the things that you would have absolutely no idea that I was telling other people unless I told you. And I think I made the comment last week that it's interesting how important maybe it is that we let people know when we're talking about them, when we are boasting in them, when we are saying these positive things, that sometimes it's like we tell everybody except the person themselves about it. And so I've been gone away from here. I don't know, maybe you may have noticed, maybe not, quite a bit over the last few months. We've been, since November, we've been in Kansas, and we've been in Missouri and the St. Louis area with multiple people, staying with them. We've been in Louisville. I've been in Orlando. I've been in Tampa, quite a few different places. And one of the questions that I get asked almost without fail, one of the first things that people say, they say, "Hey, how do you like Oregon?" And the first thing that I do say is, "It is beautiful there," because it is beautiful there. But then I say, but even more important, I tell you what, I have found myself with a really solid group of Christians. The church there is wonderful. There's a really strong eldership that I get along with really well. The people are very encouraging and uplifting. They're very encouraging to us when we find ourselves in bad situations. They take care of us, like with our sickness recently. Thanks goes out to folks who helped us. And I want to mention names. I'll go ahead and mention some names. I might even leave some out because that's how much people help us. But I know that we were brought food. The Wrens brought us some food. The Hafers brought us some food. I know the Basingers brought us some food. The Rothweilers brought us some food. Faye, helped in taking care of all of that. A lot of people were involved. I may have missed some. And here's the thing. I know that even though I just named about 4 or 5 names, if I would have picked up the phone and called a whole slew of other folks, there would have been food there within a half an hour or so. Maybe longer. Some of y'all live more than a half hour away. But I know that you would have taken care of us because I know that that's the type of people who are here. And that's what I tell people. And that's what I let people know. And I let people know that I'm part of a group here that lets me say what the Bible says, to open it up, to challenge, to think about things. And a group of people that wants to engage in that, to have the back and forth, to talk about it. They want to be challenged, see new ideas, new ways of looking at it, to look at things from fresh perspectives. I let people know that this is a group that encourages me all the time, and that we love being part of this group. And here's the thing. I've been telling everyone else, I wanted to make sure that I told you. That comment that I made last week, it was one of those where you make an observation, you say it, and then it hits and says, I said that, but I don't do it myself very well. Well, I'm going to try to change that, perhaps. And I wanted to start this morning just saying, I think I'm speaking for the family here, we really appreciate you. And we have been telling folks all over the country about this good, solid, great group that is right here in Salem. And I want you to know that and hopefully be encouraged by that. Because if you're not encouraged by it, that means right now you're just awkward by that. So I'm going to move on in case you are in that awkward position. But I did want you to know that you are being talked about. And that's the important thing, that we understand how much we are together. We do have folks who are visiting with us this morning, and we are really glad you're here. One of the group, I knew I was going to miss some names, the Haleys, who took care of our cat, who would have died probably in all of that time if they hadn't been doing that. I wanted to make sure to give them a special thanks, because they put in a lot of going over and going over and going over. I could see every time they walked in to our house, we have those little video doorbell things. I'm like, yep, there's Joseph again, and stuff. So anyway, just everything that everybody here does for us, we are so thankful to be a part of you, a part of us together. And it is important that we recognize that. Those of you who are visiting with us, we're really glad you're here. And I'm sorry that you had to sit through that. But no, I'm not really sorry. But I hope that you can see, if you're visiting with us, the kind of group that we have here, a very loving, strong, connected group that even in the midst of everything that's gone on in the last couple of years, have maintained a fervor for being together, a fervor for one another, a fervor for unity, really no matter what it costs. And I absolutely love that. And I hope that if you are visiting, you will be encouraged by this group that is right here as we really discuss this idea of how we can emulate Jesus in the singing that was done together. As I noted earlier, I already mentioned it, but we'll go to Matthew chapter 26, and starting in verse 17. It says, "On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?' And he said, 'Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." Now I'm going to skip down to verse 26. "While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' When he'd taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.' After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives." Now here Jesus and his disciples, they are partaking, they're partaking the Passover celebration. I'm fairly confident, although it's one of those things that there's some wording in various places, and whether we have the exact date and what they're doing down, I think is kind of irrelevant compared to what we know they were doing. This may not have been the actual Passover meal. It may have simply been a meal that was part of the preparation. You know, remember the Passover was part of a whole week-long celebration, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Everything that's a part of that was all leading up to, building up to the Passover itself. This is just one of those, I think, it's a preparatory meal for the overall feast, and it's included, the festival included more than just the single Passover meal itself. Nevertheless, it is certainly tied to the Passover. And we are supposed to, no matter which gospel you're reading out of, wherever you find this story, we're supposed to see that Jesus and his disciples are involved in the Passover feast. It's tied to the Passover. The meal is part of the whole thing. So when we look at this, whether or not it's the actual night of the Passover, we need to understand this meal in the context of the Passover. It is, in fact, connected. So in the midst of this meal, Jesus provides a new significance to the pieces, the emblems, the things that were a part of this meal. So they finish what we now call the Lord's Supper, and what do? They sing a hymn together. They get together, they sing. The question then becomes, what did they sing? And you could say, well, who knows? It's not important. It doesn't tell us what they sang. It could have been any number of things, and there is something to that. I mean, it is silent. Matthew doesn't tell us exactly what it is, but I think we can be pretty confident based on the fact that this is part of the Passover celebration, part of really the overall Passover meal. I think we can be pretty confident exactly what it is that they are singing. Most likely they're following the typical Jewish tradition, and they're singing, whether it's the full series of the Hallel Psalms, or some speculate that maybe they just focus on the final of the Hallel Psalms on this particular night. But it is at least clear that this is what they're singing as they come together, the Hallel Psalms. These are the Psalms that go from Psalm 113 to Psalm 118. And they had a generic use. In general, when you were overjoyed, you're celebrating something, when you're excited about something, you could pull out the Hallel Psalms and you can sing about your excitement. Remember, we read the psalm. We read it just a few minutes ago together. They sang the Psalms. That would be like us taking out our hymnal and saying, well, let's read the words to "Here we are, but straying pilgrims." No, we wouldn't read it. We would sing it. And the singing, it uplifts. It adds something special to it. That's what they would be doing. And so in a very generic sense, you would sing these on joyous occasions. However, during the Passover, we know that it was very specifically sung. These psalms were very specifically sung, usually together as one song. Sometimes they would break it up. Thus, it's very likely that the Hallel Psalms, and if not all of them, the final of the Hallel Psalms is exactly what Jesus sang with his disciples on the very night that he was betrayed. Now, let's take a look at these psalms, and let's see how it is that they are connected to the Passover. To do that, I just want to do a very quick, a very brief reminder of what the Passover was all about. Remember, at the beginning of Exodus, the people cried out. God remembered the covenant that he had made with their fathers, and so he comes down. He sends Moses to them to deliver them out. And then you have a series of plagues that take place. And so, you have these 9 plagues that were sent by God upon the Egyptians. Water that turned to blood, the cattle dying, hail, all of these. They weren't just arbitrary plagues. These plagues were there to demonstrate God's dominance over the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. And there's some neat charts, you can find them online, which will help you to see how each of the plagues is kind of connected to one of the Egyptian gods in some way, shape, or form. But I don't think we're supposed to be as nitpicky as that, as much as to just see this is God's power on display in ways that the Egyptian gods were unable to deliver their people. God systematically shows he is more powerful than anything that they worship. And then he follows it up at the very end in Exodus chapters 12 and 13. He concludes it by showing his dominance over really the one God, to some degree, that was worshipped, Pharaoh himself. And so that brings us then to the 10th plague. The 10th plague was the death of the firstborn in all the households. God is going to send a destroyer to kill all the firstborns in Egypt, people, animals, everything. And one would assume that God's like, well, I mean, this is just for the Egyptians. I don't want to harm my people. And so he just goes to the destroyer and says, hey, when you go through, just make sure that you don't hurt any of those Israelites. Just hit the Egyptians, right? One would assume that that's the way that God would handle this, except when you read through the account, you realize that's not the way it was handled at all. In chapter 12, Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 21, it says, Moses called for all the elders of Israel, said to them, go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families, and slay or kill the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood in the basin to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. None of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door, will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. So he told them, God tells them, you need a very specific sacrifice of a perfect lamb. We didn't talk about it here, but he tells them you have to eat it in a very specific, certain fashion. And then you take the blood from the sacrifice and apply it on the doorpost and the lintel all around the door. And that blood then would be a sign for the destroyer. Continuing on, I missed. It says, you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever, when you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised. You shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt. So the blood was supposed to be a sign for the destroyer, so that when he saw the blood on the door, he would then pass over the house, which is really an oversimplification of what you actually find in the text there. But for now, it works until we do a deeper dive into Exodus chapter 12 at some point. But this is how God saved Israel from the destroyer. And remember, God not only uses this event in order to save Israel from the destroyer, but really, he's doing all kinds of things from this. He saves them from Egypt. All of this salvation is put together in the Passover event. He saves them from their Egyptian bondage. He saves them, their firstborn, from the destroyer. He showed dominance over the Egyptian gods. And how does he conclude it? He concludes it with a memorial meal that'll last through the generations. In the midst of this, somewhere along the way, the Jews, the Israelites, they traditionally began singing a certain set of psalms that they saw correlate to this deliverance by God. And I know it's not going to be any surprise given what I've already said, but those are what we call the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118. Now, we're not going to read through all of these psalms, but let me just take a quick note of what you find in them. Psalm 113, this is a simple praise psalm that starts off the Hallel Psalms. It really sets the tone of thanksgiving for what it is that God has done. Psalm 114 is very clearly connected to the Passover because it speaks about how God helped them through Egypt, out of Egypt, and through the wilderness. Psalm 115 makes a comparison of the one true God that Israel served, and then all the empty gods that all the other nations served. That's basically what the plagues were all about, to demonstrate God's power over their empty idols. Psalm 116 is a psalm of thanksgiving in which the psalmist has been delivered from death, which is, again, exactly what God does for his people, delivering them out of Egypt. And then Psalm 117, which was read in our hearing just a few minutes ago, very short psalm. It's just simply a psalm of praise. Very short, to the point. It thanks God for his grace upon Israel. And it's the very shortest of the Hallel Psalms that sets up the longest one, perhaps the most meaningful of them. And that is Psalm 118, which John read for us just a few moments ago. This is a psalm of thanksgiving that God delivered the psalmist in his time of distress. Based upon this, he demonstrates future trust in God for God's continued deliverance, saying, I know what you have done for me, therefore I trust that you will continue to do this for me. Like you see in verse 6, the Lord is for me. I will not fear. What can man do to me? It's that understanding that says God has always been there, therefore I know God always will be there. What I want to focus on is towards the end of the psalm, verses 22 through 29. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. O Lord, save us, we beseech you. O Lord, we beseech you, send prosperity. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festival sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I give thanks to you. You are my God. I extol you. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Now, there are some phrases that are probably familiar to you as you go looking through here. First of all, the very first one, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Batteries in here. All right, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This phrase should sound pretty familiar to you, as this is one that Jesus uses and talks about. This is one that the apostles use and talk about. In fact, Mike just referenced this in this psalm, I believe, wasn't it on Wednesday night? That we kind of already talked about this. The stone which the builders rejected. This very clearly is meant to be a messianic reference, at least the way that Jesus saw it and the way that he taught his disciples to see it and understand it. Now, that's not to say that everybody understood this reference as being messianic until such a time that Jesus actually told them that it was. But once he does see this, and once he does propose this, and after the fact, when you look back, it makes a lot of sense. It was probably one of those statements they didn't understand, but Jesus makes it clear, this is indeed messianic. And so this is a section. This section right here, at least in particular, is messianic in nature. That means that it's talking about the future Messiah, the future king to come, and ultimately this is referring to Jesus. And we see as well this phrase, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. This is, if you will recall, and some of y'all, your little spidey sense is already going off, and you're like, I know, I've heard this phrase before, maybe somewhere attached to Jesus, maybe a week before the events that are taking place, as Jesus is entering into Jerusalem, and they're laying down the palm leaves. What are they crying? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, why would these people who are traveling to Jerusalem, why might they, as they are coming to Jerusalem to partake in the Passover, why might they have blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord on their mind? It's because the Hallel Psalms are connected with Passover. They've been singing them as they've been traveling from Galilee down here to Jericho, and then from Jericho across over to Jerusalem. It's in their mind, and they see it. They put the palm leaves down, and they are saying, wow, this is him. This is Jesus. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I don't think it's a coincidence that they are proclaiming this so close to the Passover. It's because it's the Hallel Psalms in the Passover. All of this to say that the very last of the Hallel Psalms, which looks back really on what God did during the Passover, it's really a psalm that is looking forward to what God is going to do for them by sending his Messiah. Thus you find a direct connection between the Passover and the deliverance of the Jews, and then the new Passover deliverance that comes through Jesus. Note the phrase that's here in verse 24, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Now, this is a great phrase. I've heard it used, seen, put up on plaques or all kinds of things, talking in a very generic or general sense, saying, you know, hey, this is the day the Lord has made, whatever day it is. It's like I would wake up tomorrow, I'd hop up out of bed like I do every morning, you know, and ready to go. You can ask my kids. That's exactly what I do when I get out of bed. It's like I'm going to hop out of bed on Monday morning. I'm like, this is the day. It's Monday. God made this day. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Well, it sounds good, but that's actually not at all what this phrase is actually doing as it's being used. And I think it's important that we understand that This is one of those phrases, there's a whole bunch of them, that sound great if you just rip them out of a context and you put them on a little plaque and you hang the plaque on the wall and you look at it and say, well, that sounds great, as long as I don't have to worry about the context. But in the context, it's not saying, hey, are you down today? Remember, God made this day, so rejoice in it instead. This day is not any generic general day. This is the day given to them by the Lord's deliverance. This is not in reference to any 24-hour period of time. Back in the Exodus, in Exodus chapter 12, when they were saved and they were delivered from Egypt, when the rest of Egypt was mourning the loss of their loved ones, they rejoiced in their salvation. It's not that it was just any day, it was that God had given them what they did not deserve. That is grace. We talked about that in our class this morning. God had provided for them a salvation, a deliverance. And from the moment that they step out of Egypt, all the way through as they get to Sinai, all of that is the day that the Lord had given to them and beyond. It's the day of God's deliverance. It's not a single 24-hour period of time. It's the entirety of God's deliverance that he's given. And really, it's no different for us. What we focus on is the day of salvation, which isn't a specific day. It's a life that's lived in God's salvation. We could look at the day which the Lord has made as the day of the cross itself on a larger sense. But my life is lived in the day of salvation. Again, not one particular 24-hour time period. That misses the point. It's the salvation that I have from God that has been made by God and been given to me. That is the day in which I now live. And that comes, as the Psalm suggests, from the Messiah who came. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And it all comes back to the sacrifice that you see in the Psalm, verse 27. Bind the festival sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar. This all comes because the sacrifice was bound to the altar. And I think we all know that sacrifice not only looked back to the Passover, but this verse looks forward to the Passover of all Passovers. In fact, when we look at it, we understand when there's a reference to the Passover lamb, which is made by Paul, by Jesus, by others, and even in Revelation, you see this picture that's depicted the lamb who was sacrificed. It all goes back to the idea of the Passover. It almost goes without saying that Jesus is the Passover lamb for those who are in the new covenant. And I say it almost goes without saying because I did say it, so it didn't fully go without saying. But it could have, because we understand this principle is so deeply ingrained within us. We know that. When you compare the Passover of Exodus with Jesus, we find out that both brought a deliverance out of bondage. Both involve a perfect lamb. In both, that blood's lamb must be shed, and both that blood must be applied. Both the Passover, the Passover of Exodus, the Passover of Jesus, both have a memorial meal which is eaten in observance. And it is not a coincidence that the moment that Jesus chose, that God chose for Jesus to be on that cross, the time that was for Jesus to be glorified, just happened to be during the Passover celebration. Paul himself, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, says, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. Therefore, should it surprise us at all that on the night that Jesus is going to be betrayed, the night before he will give himself willingly to be crucified to be that perfect sacrificial lamb. The night before his rejection by the builders, when the builders reject him, the night before that rejection becomes complete, and he becomes the chief cornerstone, the night as the Passover lambs themselves are being prepared throughout Israel, that night, most likely, Jesus and his disciples sing Psalm 118. Those disciples, they may not have thought much about it. They probably didn't understand the significance. To them, it was just like the Passover they celebrated last year. Maybe the year before. It's a little bit different from the year before that, probably, because they're with Jesus now and they weren't before. But the celebration itself was probably pretty standard. Things kind of went a certain way. To them, it may not have been any different from singing the Hallel Psalms and participating in them. But do you think Jesus knew as he sang Psalm 118? You think he knew what was going to happen? Do you think he understood and was singing, bind the festival sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar? Do you think he knew of God's salvation that was about to come through him? That maybe as he sang this phrase right here, understanding that what that meant is that he had to be bound to the cross itself less than 24 hours from the moment of singing. Do you think maybe there might have been a little bit of emotion as he sang these songs, as he went through Psalm 118? Perhaps he was singing in simple trust and confidence. I know that God has been there before, and I know that he will be again. If this is the hymn that was sung, I happen to think most likely that it is. We should see the significance when Jesus sings all of this and everything that the psalm has to say. And it wouldn't be a bad idea, perhaps, to incorporate these psalms somehow into our own lives. As we rejoice in what it is that God has done for us, why not make it a practice every now and then to read through these psalms in our lives, or maybe make up music to them and sing them as well. Just like Jesus, who sang these, focusing on what was about to happen. Even more than that, we understand the Psalms is one of three categories that we talked about last week, right? The Psalms, the hymns, the spiritual songs. Perhaps there's another takeaway specifically for us who are given the opportunities, those of us who have the opportunity to lead singing in worship services, to understand just how huge a responsibility that is. This individual is responsible for the teaching that takes place. This individual who leads the singing is choosing the words by which we teach and we admonish one another. He's choosing the psalms that are going to get stuck in our minds for the rest of the day, perhaps the rest of the week. This individual is choosing the words that are going to be taught. And if we take a cue from the Hallel Psalms, which all had to do with the centralized theme around the event for which they were gathered to celebrate, could that carry over for us? Let me suggest in our own worship assemblies, we need, especially those of us, whatever the case, we have the opportunity to put together the song services, that we put plenty of thought, plenty of preparation into the songs that are chosen. And I will say this, I really appreciate that seems to be the norm here. That is exactly what happens. There are themes that run throughout the Psalms and that we sing, the songs, that people contact me and say, hey, what are you preaching about? Is there anything that we can do to incorporate? And sometimes, yes, sometimes no. If my entire sermon is about, children who are disobedient and all of that type of stuff, which we've done before, there's not a lot of songs about that, perhaps. But sometimes they do flow incredibly well. And when all of the worship seems to be involved around this central theme of sorts, instead of somebody just saying, oh man, am I leading singing this morning? Well, let me crack open to Chris's favorite hits and pick those out, or whatever the case is. If we put thought and attention into all of it, worship can become an incredibly meaningful and helpful experience. But just like anything else, it can also be a detracting and irrelevant event. And sometimes when that happens, we put the blame on the person joining the worship, and we say, well, you as an individual, you need to prepare your own heart and make sure that your heart is right for fellowship. And if you didn't get anything out of it, well, that's your fault. But I would suggest there should be a certain amount of blame that rests on the shoulders of those who prepare and lead the worship as well. When all of the pieces of worship come together in a thoughtful, harmonious whole, it makes the entire experience not only more uplifting, but more conducive for teaching and admonishing, and the ideas and thoughts that we have that get repeated over and over. And for now, I'm hoping that having a deeper appreciation for the 118th Psalm will help us in our own lives to appreciate what it is that God has done for us. Folks, this is the day of salvation that the Lord has given to us. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Let's pray together. Our great God and creator of all things, we stand in awe of you now as we consider all that you have done for us in our lives. Particularly, we thank you for our own Passover experience through our own Passover lamb who died on the cross for our transgressions and who was raised for our justification. We thank you for Jesus, and in his name we now pray. Amen.